Okay, so welcome to the next module. This is Dr. K doing the voiceover. So this next module is on the musculoskeletal system and its disorders. So the first part of the module, we're just going to review the different aspects of the musculoskeletal system, go into a bit of detail and anatomy about each component. And then we're going to follow that up with discussing different disorders of the musculoskeletal system and also complications of those disorders. Okay, so when we're thinking of the musculoskeletal system, here are the different components that we're going to review and then discuss different conditions. So the skeletal muscles will be the main focus in terms of muscles. Yes, there's cardiac muscle and there's smooth muscle. We're not going to focus on those in this module very much at all. Okay. Then bones. So the main structure and the skeleton of the body. Okay. We'll discuss the anatomy of bones first, and then get into talking about fractures and conditions of the bones. Cartilage, so a very smooth tissue that provides some structure, and well, it provides structure to a number of different parts of the body that we'll see, and also it's part of the growth of typically long bones. Okay, so we'll get into the different types of cartilage. Joints that are connecting to bones and allowing mobility. And depending on which joint we're talking about, the mobility may be slightly different. So we'll talk about how different joints bend or move depending on where the joint is in the body. Okay, so it's pretty amazing that different joints have different movements to perform different functions. The bursa, so bursa are just little sacs. They have a bit of fluid in them normally, and they surround joints typically. And what do? Well, they allow tendons to move over the joints with very minimal resistance. Otherwise, the tendons would be rubbing up against the bones, and it would lead to tendinitis. So they're carefully placed little sacs that provide minimal resistance as all these tendons are moving around a joint. Okay. Tendons and ligaments. So we'll get into these a bit more. So tendons are what attach muscle to bones, and when the muscle contracts, it allows for movement of the bone, and it exerts that through tendons, right? So there's typically a muscle. On one side of the muscle, there's a tendon that attaches to a particular bone, say the humerus, and there's another tendon that attaches, say, to the lower arm, such as the radius or the ulna. And when the muscle contracts, it shortens, it puts force through the tendons, and it moves the joints. Okay. Ligaments attach bones to bones, so they provide strength to typically to joints, right? So, for example, your ankle joint is surrounded by a number of ligaments, so that when you go over on your ankle, when you invert your ankle, the ligaments provide some strength so that, for example, your ankle doesn't completely dislocate. Okay, so ligaments provide significant strength to joints. Okay, so let's look at skeletal muscle function. Okay, so There's hundreds of skeletal muscles in the body that their main function is to move the skeleton, right? To provide for movement. And through muscles, it also allows for posture. So for example, your back muscles and your abdominal muscles, they provide posture. Say for example, when you're sitting there or when you're standing. Otherwise, without your back muscles, you would just be stooped over, right? So you're continually using muscles to maintain posture, okay? And we can classify muscles depending on their function as well. Are they flexor muscles or are they extensor muscles? So for example, the biceps, well, they're flexor muscles, okay? The triceps, they provide for extension of the elbow joint. So we would call those extensor muscles, okay? And these striated muscles are under voluntary control. So the somatic nervous system, okay? And we'll get into a bit more detail about skeletal muscle. They're similar to cardiac muscle cells in terms of being striated. They're quite different than smooth muscles, where we're going to find in blood vessels, the gastrointestinal tract. They're not as organized as the striated skeletal muscle. Okay, so let's just do a bit of anatomy review on skeletal muscles, where you have the actin and myosin that are in between each other, and the actin attaches to the Z lines, and this is going to result in what we call a sarcomere. Okay, so that's a very small section of a muscle fiber. Okay, so when we include multiple sarcomeres, we can call it a myofibril. And then as it's bundled, we'll call it a muscle fiber. Okay, so muscle cell. And then finally, multiple muscle fibers, we can call a muscle bundle. And that's going to make up the different skeletal muscles around the body. Okay, so the actin and myosin, if you remember from earlier classes, is what's going to be responsible, along with calcium present, for active contraction, right? And when the actin and myosin can move against each other, it results in muscle shortening, which is going to put some tension on the tendon, which is attached to a bone, resulting in movement of the bone. Okay. Okay, so when we're looking at skeletal muscles, muscles in groups are separated by a fascial lining. Okay, so if we look at the image on the right, a cross section of the calf, you can see that there's many different muscle compartments that are separated by this fascia. And that allows for contraction of muscles in a certain compartment, and without affecting the other compartments in terms of movement. Okay, so it separates the muscle groups. Okay, because depending on what movement your body wants, it'll determine which muscle groups are contracting. So, for example, if you want to dorsiflex your ankle, so bring your ankle up, well, you're going to use the anterior compartment of your calf muscles. If you want to plantar flex your ankle, you're going to use a different muscle group compartment. Okay, so and the fascia allows them to move with less friction between them. Now, this is going to become much, much more important later, because if there's a significant injury to a limb or to part of the body where edema forms within a compartment, that can lead to very high pressures within a compartment and lead to an assortment of different conditions and damage to the structures within the compartment. And we'll talk about that later when we get into the diseases. So this is just a reminder of Starling's law, where the actin and myosin that are in the sarcomeres, when they're at an optimal length, meaning if the muscle has stretched a bit before the contraction, so it's in an optimal muscle length, then the actin and myosin are overlapping perfectly, and it's going to allow for optimum force through the muscles. Okay? If the muscles are really shortened and they're not in a good position, then the actin and myosin won't be overlapping properly, and the muscle will provide less force. And the opposite is true too. If the muscle is incredibly stretched and you want to contract that muscle, you won't be able to provide as much as much strength and force, because the actin and myosin aren't quite overlapping each other as well. So that's Starling's law. And there's also Starling's law of the heart, right? So if the heart muscle is really, really stretched, say in congestive heart failure, and the actin and myosin are just not overlapping well, the force of contraction of the heart muscle is going to be reduced. And that's what can happen in congestive heart failure. Okay, so really Starling's law is a law of any muscle fibers, in particular cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle. Okay, so just a bit more of anatomy of the neuromuscular junction. So you have your somatic nerve or your motor nerve coming to the muscle fibers. So we'll call that the motor end plate. Okay, so it's where the axon and the muscle meet, and we call that the neuromuscular junction. And in skeletal muscles, what's the neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine, right? So if you remember, in the parasympathetic system, the end organ, the nerves also use acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is used in the parasympathetic system at the target organ level, and it's used as the neurotransmitter for all skeletal muscles at the neuromuscular junction. Okay? The sarcoplasmic reticulum is where calcium is stored, and it's released to assist in contractions. Okay, so you have your motor neuron coming in. You have the myelin sheath on the motor neuron. You have the synapse, which is between the motor neuron and the muscle. You have acetylcholine that's going to be released in the setting of an action potential coming down the motor neuron. Acetylcholine will then bind to acetylcholine receptors on the muscle, and then that will lead to muscular contraction. Okay, so let's move on to bones a bit. Remember, we're just reviewing all these different components of the musculoskeletal system. So the functions of bone, well, it's the supporting structure of the body, right? It's your skeleton. So without your bones, there would be very little structure, and we certainly wouldn't be the height that we are, since we'd be this little pile of tissue on the ground. Okay, so bones provide a lot of structure. Okay, and as well. It allows the body to bear weight, right? So, and that's why a lot of the joints in your legs tend to get injured over time, or they tend to develop osteoarthritis, a wear and tear arthritis. So our knees, our hips are very prone to osteoarthritis. Why? Well, partly because they're carrying us around for our lifetime, right? So they're constantly bearing weight. What else do bones do? Well, they provide protection to internal organs. So, for example, our ribs provide protection to our heart, our lungs. Tucked under the ribs on the left side is the spleen and the stomach. Tucked under the right side is the liver and the gallbladder. In the back, the lower ribs provide a bit of protection to the kidneys. They don't totally cover the kidneys, but they provide a bit of protection to the kidneys. The vertebra provides protection, of course, to the spinal cord and the cauda equina, which is the end of the spinal cord at around L1, and then the nerve fibers continue as the cauda equina. And of course, the skull provides protection to the brain. Okay, so a lot of internal organ protection. Voluntary movement, we've spoken about, where the muscles that cross joints, when they contract, the joints act as levers, right? And they're able to move. So flexion and extension of any joint, your elbows, your wrist, your knees, your ankles, your hips, your back, right? Blood cell production, so your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets, all made in the bone marrow, okay? And of course, storage of minerals, in particular calcium and phosphorus. The vast majority of your calcium is stored within bones, okay? And it binds to phosphorus and can be released for calcium homeostasis, right? And that's controlled through your parathyroid hormones, which are on the back of your thyroid gland. So 2 pairs of parathyroid hormones. Okay, when we're talking about bones, what cells do we think of? Well, osteoblasts, which typically lay down more bone. Osteocytes, which are typically mature bone cells. They can be involved in organizing remodeling of the bone. And osteoclasts, which are involved in resorption or breakdown of the bone. Okay, so typically when we're thinking of bone synthesis, okay, osteoblasts. Bone breakdown, osteoclasts. And it's an active process that's happening all the time. So there's new bone being laid down throughout your body, and there's bone that's also being broken down. And this active process is always taking place. Now, the process can be affected by medications, by activity level, by disease states. So, for example, what happens if you lay in bed for days or weeks? Well, you're going to have bone resorption. The body is going to sense that you're not using the bones for weight bearing, and it can gradually start to break down the bone, okay, and release calcium and phosphate. Certain conditions lead to poor bone matrix and poor mineralization of bones, such as osteoporosis, which is a demineralizing condition. Okay, typically in women, and typically post-menopausally, because they've lost estrogen, which is very protective to maintaining bone density. Okay, so typically with the aging process, osteoclasts break down bones more rapidly than osteoblasts produce bones. Okay, and in particular in women, this leads to osteoporosis. And a lot of bone is lost in women in the first 5 years after menopause. Okay, so that's why we start to see common fractures in women after relatively minor falls, such as wrist fractures, hip fractures, vertebral fractures. Okay, less common in men. Men start off with more bone mass, and they still have the male hormone, testosterone. Okay, so they don't get the same degree of bone breakdown that women do. Okay, so let's look at the ways that the body organizes its bone into two types of bone. So compact bone, which is the really strong exterior part of bones, and they're made up of groups called osteons that typically run parallel to the bone. So for example, in your femur, the outer part of your femur will be compact bone, okay? And it'll be composed of groups called osteons. Okay? The cancellous bone tends to be more inside, within the bone itself, okay? And they don't have osteons. They consist of trabecular canals, and this makes them significantly lighter, right? And they're often within the bone, so they can be within cortical bone. And trabecular bone, if it calcifies, can actually become cortical bone. But cortical bone can never become trabecular bone, okay? So what's trabecular bone for? Well, it provides a bit of shock absorber effect for bones compared to the cortical bone that doesn't have as much give, and it's also where the cell lines of the bone marrow are produced. So the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. Okay. So let's look at a couple of differences between compact bones and cancellous or spongy bones. So the compact bone is what forms the outer exterior part of the bone, whereas typically the spongy bone or the trabecular bone is found on the interior of bony structures. Okay. The compact bone, typically for long bones, is what makes the diaphysis. So in between the two ends of a long bone, such as your femur, so the diaphysis is the long part between the knee and the hip. That's the diaphysis. That's made up of cortical bone. Okay. Whereas the trabecular bone will be more involved in the epiphysis, where long bones are enlarging. Okay, so that'll have more trabecular bone. So if we look at the femur, so towards the hip joint, as you see in this image, and also towards the knee joint, if we had the whole femur here, that would have trabecular bone. Okay. And the epiphysis is another name for the growth plate. Okay, so that in children, before the epiphysis closes, the long bones can continue to grow. Okay, compact bone, very strong. Okay, rigid and strong and very smooth. Whereas spongy or trabecular bone, very light. Okay, so you can imagine if we were made completely of cortical bone, well, not only wouldn't we make bone marrow, which would be a problem, but we'd be significantly heavier. Okay, so the body doesn't want to be lugging around extra weight. So it has an outer cortical bone for strength. Okay. In cortical bone, you have those osteones that are really tightly packed together, okay, organizing the compact bone. In trabecular bone, there aren't any osteones, okay, so basically there's just minerals that form the trabecula. And remember, most of your calcium is being held up in cortical bone, okay, so in the form of calcium phosphate. Okay, the compact bone, that gives strength and structure to the skeletal system. Whereas the trabecular bone, as I mentioned, provides more of a buffering compared to the compact bone. Okay. Within compact bone, so in the long bones, say your femur, your humerus, you'll actually have what we call yellow marrow. In the trabecular bone, we'll have red marrow, which is where your blood cells will be produced. Okay. The compact bone makes up about 75 to 80% of total bone weight compared to the lighter trabecular bone, which is about 20%. Okay. And I think that's probably enough information on bones. Okay, so this image, let's say this bone is the femur. It's not quite the femur because there's no hip joint to it, but let's just say it's a long bone. Okay, so when I was saying diaphysis before, well, that's where the image is showing you the term compact bone. So the diaphysis is the long middle segment, whereas the epiphysis is the growth plate on either ends of the bone in a growing child up until the epiphysis closes. Okay, so you have diaphysis in the middle, epiphysis at each end of long bones. Okay, so now we have a hip joint, or sorry, a femur on the left there. Okay, and when we're talking about the cortical compact bones, well, they're the ones that have those Haversian systems, and they're made up of osteons. Okay, so we're not going to get into too much detail about those. Just know that compact bone is made up of osteon. They're organized into osteons. Okay, and compact bone forms the outer part of bones typically. Compared to the trabecular bone, where you can see in the upper part of the image of the femur on the left that the bone's becoming more trabecular. Okay, so it's not going to have as much strength, but it's going to provide production of bone marrow. It's going to act as a bit of a shock absorber for the bone itself. But as you will see and probably realize by now, hip fractures are really common as people age and develop demineralization of the bones and osteoporosis. Okay. Okay, so let's look at a long bone here. So I already mentioned that the middle segment, which is made up mainly of compact bone, is the diaphysis, or the shaft of the bone. On each side, there's the epiphysis. Okay, so the epiphyseal head, but the epiphyseal plate um, on either ends of the long bone is where the bone grows. Okay, so once we reach adulthood, our epiphyseal plates have closed, so we have no ability to continue to grow. Okay, so you can imagine that injuries to the epiphyseal plate in a child can really impede the growth of the injured bone, right? So that's why we get a bit more concerned when there's a fracture and it's involved the epiphyseal plate, or what we call the growth plate. Okay. So let's continue on here. Let's start at the top. Articular cartilage. Well, that's where either end of the bone is going to become a joint, right? And you have nice, smooth, articular cartilage. Okay, so in this case, one's going to articulate and become the hip joint with articular cartilage, and one's going to be the distal femur, and it'll be part of the knee joint. So the epiphysis, remember the growing end of the bones, in particular at the growth plate. The diaphysis is the middle part of the bone, the shaft, and then lining the surface of your bones is what's called the periosteum. And it's almost like a saran wrap that's really vascular and extremely sensitive. So we all know that, for example, if you happen to hit your shin on a table, or if you get kicked in the shin, hopefully accidentally, it's exquisitely sensitive, right? Very painful. And that's the periosteum that's being injured. Okay, so so think of it as a saran wrap that has many blood vessels and also a lot of sensory nerve fibers in the periosteum.